So it's great to see everyone made it into Friday afternoon. My name is David Baluarte. I direct the Immigrant Rights Clinic here at Washington and Lee, a third-year experience where our students represent immigrants in removal proceedings and other matters. I want to thank my colleagues, first of all, Professors Shaughnessy, Massey, and Helwig, for including non-citizens in this conversation about child welfare. Immigration can be a divisive issue, and too often emotions, I think, cloud the important sort of fundamental nature of a couple things that we know to be true, such as the importance in our society of family unity, special protections that should be accorded to children, the fundamental nature of the procedures with which we defend these rights to family unity and children's rights. We have three fantastic speakers that have come here to help us navigate some of these difficult questions. I'll introduce them in the order that they will present. First, we are fortunate to have Professor Zug here from the University of South Carolina. She writes extensively about the intersection between immigration and family law. Some of her recent work has exposed the growing practice of separating fit immigrant parents from their American citizen children. This has garnered national attention, and she's going to be speaking to us more about that work today. After Professor Zug, we're going to hear from Ashley Ham-Pong, who is a supervising attorney for the Detained Children's Program at the CARE Coalition. That's the Capital Area Immigrant Rights Coalition. Ashley Ham-Pong works screening and representing unaccompanied immigrant children, ages 10 to 17, who are detained in Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, detention facilities. And then we have David Fink from the Office of Refugee Resettlement, who has a fantastic background. Right now he's working as a federal field specialist for ORR, although before that he was working for 7 years with Child Protective Services in Arizona. A wealth of experience that he brings to ORR and that he'll be talking to us about today. Without further ado, let's hear from Professor Zug.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I'm a little thrown off because I've presented this talk before, but now I want to add in all of the other things that have been discussed earlier, and I'm like, well, I could start this way or that way. So maybe I'll highlight some things that are in my talk that have been brought up before. So one of them is the potential conflict between parental rights and children's rights. Because that's a lot of times what you see in these foster care placement possible cases, removal cases. Our overriding interest is the best interest of the child, but what does that mean? Is the parent's interest the same as the child's interest? Is it different? What do we do when it's different? In the immigration context, and not only in immigration, but you often have the state's interest, and where does that align? So a lot of what I look at is how these three different interests work out. Is it parents against children, against the state? All of these come into it when we're talking about the rights of children in general, and especially the children of immigrants, and particularly undocumented immigrants. So I'm a family law professor. I didn't originally start my work thinking that I was going to do immigration law. I don't teach immigration law, but I may start to now, because what happened was that I would come across various family law cases, stories, issues, and they'd have these immigration aspects, and there are very few people who were in academia who were looking at the intersection of the two of them. So that's where I do a lot of my work. The way I came into this particular project, I was reading the newspaper. Yeah, that's where I get all my brilliant ideas. And no laughing. And there was a New York Times article a number of years ago about 3 cases of undocumented immigrant parents who had lost custody of their children. And the scenario is basically this. You have an undocumented parent or parents who get picked up by immigration. They get thrown into a detention facility. They have children. The children get placed in some sort of foster care. The parents kind of disappear into the system. Then they get deported. The kids are still here. Well, what are you going to do? You don't want to leave the kids in foster care, right? So you terminate the parents' rights. And I'm not even sure how neutral I was in that scenario, but I'm going to get a whole lot less neutral. So I was reading these three stories, and one of them South Carolina. So my ears always perk up with South Carolina, usually because I tend to write things like against what South Carolina is doing. And I started to look at these stories. And the way the New York Times article was written was, here are three bad cases, unfair cases, but they're kind of outliers, right? Not that this is happening. No one was saying that this is happening on a wide scale, just that this happened to these three particular families. And that struck me as possibly wrong, because by the time it comes to the attention of the New York Times, for every one case that they find, there have to be, 100, 1,000. Well, it's, tens of thousands probably, which is kind of the numbers we're getting. So I started looking into this, and I used to be a journalist myself, so I started emailing family law practitioners just to get a sense if they had ever seen these kinds of cases. And guess what? Every single person I emailed, they all had at least one. But they all thought theirs was the only one. Right? They thought, there's this horrible thing going on. I don't really know what to do with these cases. Again, kind of an outlier. So there was no real national recognition at the time that this was happening on a wide scale. It's like, okay, I'm going to look into this. This is happening on a wide scale. Why is it happening? And my automatic gut instinct was immigration. Bad immigration. Immigration. And of course it's immigration, right? To some extent. You wouldn't have undocumented parents losing their children if they weren't getting deported. And why are they getting deported? Because of immigration. So yes, it's immigration. But then I started to look at the immigration law. And the immigration law with regard to the separation of deported parents and their children is, so there are cases where immigrant parents have appealed to the different immigration authorities about the fact that their deportation will separate them from their children, that even if they're undocumented, they have certain constitutional rights, including the right as a fit parent to the care and custody of their children. So they're bringing constitutional cases. There are also cases where children left behind have brought their own constitutional cases, saying that they're being deprived of a constitutional right to family unity. And they lose in all of these cases because what immigration courts say is, you can go with them. You want to stay here, that's fine. If you're, a U.S. citizen, you can stay here. But we're not making you stay here. We're deporting your parents, that is true. But you can go back with them. So immigration law says that there's nothing to stop these children from being returned with their parents. That's not the purpose of the deportation. Take them with you. Not our problem, end of story. So, there are reasons why it is harder. I'm going to talk about that too. And there's some new regulations that ICE has just put in place to make it easier for deported parents to take their children with them. Certainly immigration wasn't being helpful before, and the new initiatives maybe are going to be more helpful. But what I found in my research was that I couldn't really say immigration was sort of the driving force behind this. So I started to look at more of these cases. And what I found was a lot more complicated and had a lot to do with state child welfare officials and courts. And the idea that it's not good for children to be with these types of parents. That the rule, the law is that if you are a fit parent, you have a constitutional right to the care and custody of your child. But what a fit parent is can have some, fuzziness about it. And what is in the children's best interest, there's a lot of room there. So what I began seeing in these cases were the assumption that undocumented parents, pretty much by definition, were unfit. You've got cases where the courts say things like, well, the mother crossed the border pregnant or with a newborn, doesn't really matter which one, either way she's an unfit parent. Not because of anything she did beyond that, but by being an undocumented parent in the United States. There are cases where, some of the most egregious ones are, she's an undocumented parent and she doesn't speak English, so therefore she puts the child at risk, terminate parental rights. I was seeing a lot of these cases where the push was to remove children from undocumented parents based on the assumption that undocumented parents are unfit parents, that it's in the children's best interest to be not with them. And then, hey, we've got immigration law that can make this easy. Because some of the stuff we've been talking about earlier, placement plans and reunification, and even if you only have 10 and a half months now, that's still quite a while. But when you have undocumented parents, you put them in deportation proceedings. You can pretty much guarantee, at least before this new parental interest directive and perhaps continuing, you can pretty much guarantee that they're gone, that this kid will be, within the year, available for adoption. And if you think it is in the child's best interest to be separated from these parents, and you want to guarantee that, well, what I began seeing was a lot of social service agencies actually began calling ICE. So they would get, there would be different reasons that the child would come to their attention. Sometimes simply because the mother didn't speak English. They would look at this family, decide that this child would be better off somewhere else, and rather than starting with the normal assessment and placement plans, they would call ICE. ICE would remove the mother, and then they could automatically use that as abandonment and terminate the parent's rights. Now, why is that going on? One of my other areas that I write in is on federal Indian law and the removal of Indian children from their parents. And we talked about orphan trains earlier. A lot of that had to do with the belief that Catholic children were better off with Protestant families. Indian children are better off with not Indian families. Immigrant children perhaps are better off not with their immigrant families. And there's a lot going on in the adoption industry. Industry is probably a loaded word too, but there's money. And a lot of these children were highly adoptable. A lot of them are babies. A lot of them are fairly white. If you add that with, you think it's in the child's best interest to remain in America, which there's an argument for that. I mean, I told you that we've got three different interests going on: children's interest, parents' interest, state's interest. A lot of these kids are American citizens. Where do you want your American citizens raised? Guatemala? Or here? The state probably has an interest in keeping these children here. The state's not going to allow their parents to stay here. Then maybe it's in the state's interest to keep them here. It's not in the parents' interest. Then you look at the child's best interest, and you have different views on that. So if you believe that's in the child's best interest to be with their biological parents, that's the overriding one, then you would advocate sending them back. If you think it's in the child's best interest to, be raised in America with all the benefits that come with life in America, then you might be swayed more, you add the state's interest into that, then they should stay. But a lot of what we see in these court cases is the belief that it is in the child's best interest to stay here. Maybe there's an argument for. What there isn't an argument for is that automatically by being an undocumented parent, you are an unfit parent. And the problem with the best interest analysis is they were getting to it too early. You don't do a best interest analysis until you find parents unfit. Thank God, right? Think about it. Are you the best parent for your children? Look around. Is there anyone who's better? Because if we start going down that path, we are all in trouble. My kid has a black eye every single week. I try really hard, really, right next to her, yet she still falls off the slide. Though perhaps you would be right there on the slide with her and making sure she wouldn't fall off. But thank goodness I'm fit enough that we don't actually make that analysis. Thank goodness. So that's what's going on in these cases, though. They're going straight to the best interest analysis. And I think there's an argument. I've argued on both sides of it. You can make an argument that it might be in the best interest of American citizen children to be raised in America, but that's not the law. The law is you only remove children from fit parents, and being undocumented by itself with nothing more doesn't make you an unfit parent. I mentioned that there is a new directive coming out of ICE, so I want to talk about that for a second. It's called the Parental Interest Directive, and it's actually not that surprising since, as I mentioned, it's not immigration that wants to separate the children from their parents. So eventually, this separation has gotten a decent amount of media attention. ICE enacted these regulations. They're not requirements, but they're guidelines, highly recommended. And there are things to make it easier for parents to take their children with them. One of the regulations, for instance, is that the parents get help getting the documents that they need to take their children with them. A lot of these children are dual citizens. They can easily get passports to go to these other countries, but if you just put the parents in detention and then ship them right off, they don't have the way of getting their kids out of this country. They can't meet up with them to take them with them. So a lot of the directive is logistics, right? Get them the paperwork they need, meet with them so you can travel with them, put the parents in detention facilities that are near where their kids are, right? If the family court is saying that the parents need to appear for various hearings, well, you need to know where the parents are. When I've talked to a lot of the lawyers who work on these cases, they have clients who then just disappear, right? So they can't help them get to, the hearings that they need to go to. A lot of the reunification plans require visitation. Well, part of the Parental Interest Directive is that, in cases that are practical, you let the parents out to visit with the kids. If you can't do that, you at least do, video teleconferencing. A lot of these are just practical ideas. You have a point person. For all parents, all undocumented parents who have children who are in child welfare proceedings, there is now a point person for these detention facilities, so you can contact them. So the parents know who to contact, the child welfare workers know who to contact. All of these, I think it's a good thing. I think the Parental Interest Directive will make it easier, as long as the goal of everybody is to get the children back to their parents. If the goal is not, if you don't have the state and child welfare viewing that as the goal, then I'm not sure this will make that much of a difference. So, in conclusion, immigration has caused this problem. Immigration is trying to remedy it somewhat, but a lot of it really comes down to different views on what's in the best interest of immigrant children. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Baluarte, for putting on this presentation, and to Professor Zug and to David Fink. I think this is a fantastic issue to be covering in the issue of children. And I appreciated Professor Zug's perspective on families, binational families, and giving us the perspective of parents and adults. My perspective is a little bit different because I work predominantly with non-citizen children. I work for an organization called the Capital Area Immigrants' Rights Coalition. We're a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., and we work primarily with detained immigrants. And my program is actually with the children's program. Now, when I say detained, that means they are detained in special juvenile facilities, and children have to meet a specific definition of being an unaccompanied alien child under the law. which is different than the definition of a child. So we have these federal definitions that lay out the distinction between what a child and an unaccompanied child is. So unaccompanied is a term that was created in 2002 that distinguished an unaccompanied child from a child in that the child does not have a parent or legal guardian here in the United States to care for them. And the age distinction as well is different in that an unaccompanied child is under 18. But for other immigration purposes, if you see the word child, it's going to mean somebody who is under 21. And so through my work, I work with unaccompanied immigrant children who are detained by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Regardless of whether a child is unaccompanied or not, fortunately, federal immigration laws have extended special protections. Sometimes these protections extend to children by themselves, but sometimes they are additional protections for unaccompanied immigrant children because immigration recognizes that these children are even more vulnerable. Children are vulnerable anyway in this immigration system, but so are unaccompanied children because they don't have parents or legal guardians. Some of the special protections might include special administrative procedures. Maybe a child would not necessarily fight his or her case in the immigration court. Maybe it would be in a less adversarial setting. But what's important to remember is that the immigration system is quite different from the criminal system. And no immigrant who is in removal proceedings or deportation proceedings, as we call it, has a right to a free attorney. So you have a right to an attorney if you can pay for one or if you can find one, but it is very, very different from the criminal system in which we have public defenders. If somebody's facing jail time, felony, they will have a public defender appointed to them. But in the case of immigrants, that's not the case, and people are facing deportation without having attorneys. Many people will go before the immigration judge in Arlington, immigration judges in Arlington or in Baltimore, and they are pro se because they don't have anybody. It's the same for children. You have children who are 6, 7 years old. They might be going to court by themselves because maybe their parents are undocumented and the parents are afraid to go into immigration court. So you have children talking to a judge by themselves. And that's a very unfortunate situation, and really it is a huge civil rights issue in that immigration really needs to address. And so part of our role with Care Coalition is that we appear as friend of the court for any detained child who has an immigration proceeding. So there are 2 juvenile dockets that month, and so we will go and explain to the judge what the status of the case is and what the child's ultimate goals are. So we're fortunate that we have that set up here. Now, to explain unaccompanied children and children who are non-citizens, you hear the numbers in the news, you hear them all over about these large numbers of people living in the shadows, and that is very true. In terms of the numbers for unaccompanied immigrant children, when I first started at Care Coalition over 3 years ago, there were usually 8,000 or so unaccompanied children who were coming into the U.S. every year and who were being placed in the care and custody of the Department of Health and Human Services. Those numbers tripled in 2013, and so now we're seeing we saw over 24,000 children who were detained in the U.S. And this year it might double. The numbers are just increasing, and so we are seeing huge numbers in detention, but also more children are coming in who are not being apprehended. So we do have to remember that there are other non-citizen children who are living in the community and who may be facing deportation, but who may never have been detained. And in terms of breaking up the immigration system, I like to think of it in 3 components. We have the enforcement side, and many people are familiar with the Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Patrol, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, so ICE or CBP. And many times, unaccompanied immigrant children or children will come into contact with the Department of Homeland Security first. And that might be in an instance where a child is traveling by themselves through Mexico, or a lot of the kids that we work with would be from Mexico or from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. And so they might be coming in by themselves, and they're apprehended by Customs and Border Patrol. And in that case, Customs and Border Patrol, under this law that was created in 2002, the Homeland Security Act, DHS has an obligation to turn the child over to the Department of Health and Human Services, to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, within 72 hours. And in fact, they have to notify the Department of Health and Human Services within 48 hours that they have an unaccompanied immigrant child in their custody. So that's one of the special protections, is that children will be, unaccompanied children will be detained in a separate facility. Now, other ways that children may come into contact with the Department of Homeland Security may be through the delinquency system. They might have had a brush with the law, they might be in the delinquency system, and in that case, Immigration and Customs Enforcement may place a warrant on them. It's called a warrant, a detainer. And in that case, they'll be picked up and they might come into custody. Custody I won't discuss too much because David Fink is going to cover that. But overall, it's the Office of Refugee Resettlement who oversees that. And the idea behind it is to place the child in the least restrictive setting. And there were laws that came into place in 2002 that charged the Office of Refugee Resettlement with that responsibility, but before that it was actually what we call legacy INS, so Immigration and Naturalization Services, which do not exist now. And so the third part that I wanted to cover is also court, and I did speak about that a little bit, where children do not have the right to representation, but they might be placed in deportation proceedings or removal proceedings, in which case they're going to be going before an immigration judge. And they might ask for continuances to work on their case, or they might ask for a form of relief, which I'll cover in a little bit. And then they might ask to return to their home countries. And here in Virginia, we do have 4 Office of Refugee Resettlement facilities, and Care Coalition visits all of them. And they range in different levels of security. We see high security children, staff secure, which is medium security, shelter, which is your lowest security, and then we do have children in federal foster care. Usually it is similar. It mirrors the Virginia foster care program. Now, when I said forms of relief are what we call defenses against deportation. And adults have defenses against deportation, and so do children, and sometimes they overlap. But in general, there are 4 very common forms of relief that we see for both children and for unaccompanied children. From our end, we do see a lot of asylum cases. Asylum, when I'm meeting with the kids, the way I explain it is if you are fearful of returning to your home country. Under the law, that fear is actually very specifically defined in the Immigration and Nationality Act. But generally, it means you have to have a well-founded fear of persecution on account of 5 enumerated grounds. So it cannot just be any fear. It can't be, oh, I'm afraid of, one person or this group. The law has been relatively, this area is fairly gray, but sometimes it is very black and white. And so we do have to look at, why is a child fearful? Who persecuted them in the past? So who harmed them in the past? Or who might harm them in the future? And you're looking at that motive. You have to look at the on account of reason, which is usually what we call a nexus. It's like the glue. It holds your argument together to show that any harm a child is suffering could be on account of these grounds, which are race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and membership in a particular social group. So a classic example that we would see for children who we work with, as I said, a lot of them are from Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, would be children who are fearful of these huge gangs, these transnational gangs called MS-13. You may have heard of MS-13, 18th Street Gang. These gangs are just so vicious, and they recruit young children, typically young teenage males, to join in their gangs and to engage in this criminal activity. And we hear terrible stories about the gangs stalking the kids. They will watch the kids go to school and back. They'll learn their family members' names. And they'll use very, very direct threats against these children. Unfortunately, if you look at the 5 protected grounds, that might not fall under race, religion, nationality, and political opinion. And so we're usually looking at membership in a particular social group, which is very difficult to define, and immigration practitioners are constantly challenged by that problem. Now, to go into a T visa is called a T visa because of the section of law that it falls under. But the way that I remember it is for a child who's been a victim of trafficking. Now, a T visa also applies to adults. So if adults meet the definition of being a victim of a severe form of human trafficking, they will qualify for a T visa. The definition of what is a severe form of human trafficking is defined under the TVPA, and that's in my next slide. But before I move on, a person must show that they fit the definition of trafficking, and that it would not be in their best interest to return to their home country. If you show that you've cooperated with law enforcement, that's an additional, let's say, bonus in your case. It's not required that you have this certification from law enforcement certifying that you've been helpful in investigating the trafficking, but it helps. And as I mentioned, the definition of trafficking is in the TVPA and includes 2 forms of trafficking. It's labor trafficking and sex trafficking. So one of the most common claims that we will see are for children who are traveling through Mexico. They may take the freight train that runs from the south of Mexico to the north, and they're usually riding on the top of the train, which makes them very vulnerable to kidnappings by Mexican drug cartels. Mexican drug cartels predominantly target non-Mexican citizens who are very young, and in that case, they do force young girls to be sex slaves, and they do force young males into trafficking drugs for them across the border. So a very unfortunate situation. The next form of relief is a Uvisa. So a Uvisa is similar to a T visa in that it's for a victim of a crime. It's just the T visa is specifically for trafficking. But somebody who is eligible for a T visa could also be eligible for a U visa because the U visa is for a victim of a crime, and it includes 18 different crimes. And some examples would be rape, incest, assault. But there is another broad category that allows for other crimes that may be similar in the list. But again, with the U visa, somebody in this case actually has to show that they have cooperated with authorities or that they have been helpful in the investigation of a crime. So that's an additional component that they must show. And the last form of relief I'm going to cover is called Special Immigrant Juvenile Status. Now, the other forms of relief, well, U visas and T visas are a little bit newer. SIJ is one of the older visas or status that come around. It was created in 1990 under Congress, or by Congress, and it's one of the few forms of relief that actually includes a state court, a balancing between state court and federal court. For the other 3 forms of relief that I've mentioned, most of that comes under the Federal Immigration and Nationality Act, and it's adjudicated by immigration, and we hear federal. But SIJ actually includes this requirement to go through state court first. And SIJ is for children who have been abused, abandoned, and neglected. And so Immigration left this determination to state court judges. They felt that state court judges were in the best position because they hear these children's cases all the time and they know the state definition of abuse, abandonment, and neglect. There's no federal definition for these things. And what that means is that these children will go to state court. They must get a state court order that includes they've been abandoned, abused, or neglected, that it's not possible for them to reunify with one or both parents because of this mistreatment, and that it's not in their best interest to return to their home country. So again, these state court judges are applying the best interest finding, which we heard Professor Zug talk about, in that they are weighing it case by case. There is a totality of the circumstances, and they're looking at the best interest of the child. Now with this, the state court order is not giving any federal status to a child. Again, the federal government reserved that right to give status, but the state court is the gatekeeper. Without this order, a child cannot then apply for special immigrant juvenile status. Some of the benefits of lawful status would be a child might be able to travel, work, study, and they might be able to include other family members in getting status as well. And one last thing I wanted to mention, because I am running a little bit out of time, would be prosecutorial discretion, in that children who might not qualify for relief may still qualify for discretion by immigration and request that they not be deported or that their case be administratively closed for humanitarian grounds. And there are two ways for children to return to their home countries, would be voluntary departure and deportation. And so there are different requirements, but the big difference is that a child who is deported would have a 10-year bar to re-entering the United States, whereas with voluntary departure, they do not. And sometimes children can't stay here or they don't want to stay here. And so we assist them in returning in the best way possible. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to David Fink.
Thank you, Professor Zug. Thanks, Ashley, for your presentation, and thanks for having me. So, my name is David Fink, and I'm with the Office of Refugee Resettlement. We're under the Department of Health and Human Services, and we are responsible for care and custody of all unaccompanied alien children. I'm what's called a federal field specialist. So I oversee the care providers to ensure they're following the federal laws. We follow what's called the Flores Settlement Agreement and our policies and procedures, and make sure they're following their state licensing as well. And we also act as point of contact for attorneys and other stakeholders as well. So what I'd like to do is just kind of give you guys a brief overview of our history, our responsibilities, the population that we serve, how these kids come into our care, our continuum of care throughout the United States, and services we provide to these kids. So we're the Division of Children's Services. We used to be called DUCS. We changed the name. Just to let you know where we fall in the bureaucracy of Health and Human Services, we are within the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is under the Administration of Children and Families, under the Department of Health and Human Services. So we didn't always have these kids. Like Ashley had kind of mentioned, I think these are backwards. Let's see. There we go. So prior to us having custody, the former INS was responsible for care and custody of this population. Under Section 462 of the Homeland Security Act, they transferred the responsibility to care and custody of all unaccompanied children to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And then 2 days later, they formed the Division of Children's Services. And so with that, because we are used to working with children and families from other populations, I think, which was why they decided to transfer it over to us. And we also inherited the Flores Settlement Agreement, which is a lawsuit that was against the INS, I think in the 80s, and then was settled later on in the 90s about the treatment of these children as well, which was the other reason why they transferred the care and custody over to us. So we work with multiple stakeholders, both government and non-government stakeholders. So we try to have a very collaborative approach in working with these kids, because if we don't, we find the system doesn't flow. Just to give you an idea, our government stakeholders are DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and then within that we work specifically with Immigration's Customs Enforcement, United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, Customs and Border Protection, and the Immigration Courts, also known as the Executive Office of Immigration Review, EOR, as they're called. And then we also work, like I said, with non-government agencies, like Care Coalition is the group that works with our kids that are in custody in Virginia. We also work with child advocates, so sometimes kids with complex cases who are in our program long-term get advocates, and they're through the Young Center in Chicago. We also work with the Department of Justice. They provide a legal orientation, so when we identify a potential sponsor, we refer them to the legal orientation program, and they go and get a presentation on the importance of taking the kids to immigration court, protecting them from human trafficking, not being allowed to work because they're in removal proceedings, those sorts of things. And then we also work with General Dynamics Information Technology. Yes, they make missiles, but they also work with kids too. So General Dynamics Information Technology has a case coordination program. So when we're reviewing a release for each child that comes into our care, the case coordination team are a team of trained social workers that go into the facilities, that work with the care providers, they interview the children, and they do an assessment, and they provide a recommendation to ORR on release of the child. So our program main responsibilities is to provide care and custody, make and implement placement and transfer decisions, reunify with qualified sponsors. And when I say sponsor, I'm referring to parents, I'm referring to relatives, I'm referring to family friends. And oversee a network of ORR care provider facilities, and then monitor the care providers to ensure compliance with national care standards. Just to give you a rundown of the population we serve, the majority of the kids that we receive into ORR are males, so 73% males, between the ages of 14 and 17, 27% females between the ages of 14 and 17 as well, and then we have 24% below the age of 14, so we do get kids, we refer to them as tender age kids, so kids under that age, we get babies, we get toddlers, we get pregnant girls, we get girls coming, traveling with their babies, that sort of thing. And then this is the countries we primarily we have in our custody. The population is Central American. It's always been Central America. Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras all fluctuate. So one is usually sometimes higher than the other, but right now it's primarily Guatemalan, and then Honduran, and then El Salvadorian children. And then we have Mexican children, and 3%, Ecuadorian, 2%, and then we have others. So I would say the next in line would be Indian children. We get a lot of children from India, Chinese kids as well, and then everything in between. We get kids from Ghana, Uganda, Sierra Leone. We've got a kid from England once. That was weird. See kind of everything, but primarily Central American children. And many of these kids, Ashley touched on this a little bit, but they come over for a lot of different reasons, right? And, you know, when working with this population, you realize that it's really a complicated, big decision for these families, because the choices that they have, you find, are very limited. So a lot of times they're coming over to join family members that are already residing in the U.S. So mom might have come over here when the child was born because the poverty was so bad. They came over here to make money, send back to the family to take care of the child, and then save money to bring the child over. We have other kids. I think Ms. Zug talked about it as well. We have kids that have been here since they were infants and toddlers. And they're already here with their parents. We also have kids coming over by themselves. The parents have no idea that they're coming over. Family don't know they're coming over, but their situation is so dire, that the poverty is so bad, or the violence is so bad, they make the decision like, I got to come over here and have a better life. I want to work. I don't want to be in this. I don't want to be in the violence. We find that a lot of our kids only end up getting a 5th grade education before they come over. And so the kids, when they come here, they really want to go to school. They really want to, do something. So they don't have that opportunity to do that in Central American countries due to all the violence and the poverty. And then we have a lot of, like the kids, Ashley also talked about kids escaping abuse, not only in their home country but from families as well. Just like here, there's abuse and neglect issues in those countries, and families find out about it, and they will pay to bring these children over. The kids might flee. And then also, Ashley touched on, and it is a huge problem over there, is the gangs. The MS-13, the 18th Street gangs heavily recruit these kids, extort these families. I remember interviewing a kid down in San Antonio as young as 7, leaving because his mom sent for him because the gangs were trying to recruit him. So it's a serious problem. And so they're left with this horrible choice, I think. These families are left with this horrible choice. They stay in their current situation, or they take this journey, which is extremely dangerous. The train that Ashley was referring to, everyone calls it the death train, because a lot of the kids see people fall off. There's no room on them. They get robbed, they get mugged, they get raped. There's cartels on there. There are gangs extorting them for money. It's a very, very dangerous journey. They have coyotes that sometimes leave them in the middle of nowhere, and they've got to find their way through the desert and crossing rivers. I mean, it's a treacherous journey, so it makes them extremely, extremely vulnerable to be victims of human trafficking, exploitation, and abuse. So she went over the legal definition. Under the age of 18, no lawful immigration status, no parent or legal guardian in the U.S., or no parent or legal guardian in the U.S. available to provide care and custody. So how we get these kids? So they're usually they have to be referred by a federal agency. We can't take kids from CPS. We can't take them from NGOs. It has to be the federal agency. It's under the Homeland Security Act and TVPRA. This federal agency is usually 90% of the time the Department of Homeland Security, and usually the kids are being apprehended at the border. That's where primarily these kids are coming from. And like Ashley said, by law, other federal agencies, they have to transfer the custody of the kiddo to ORR within 72 hours. Like I said, they get caught usually by trying to cross the border. And then we do have a smaller group that do get caught as a result of an interior apprehension. So run in with law enforcement, kid gets picked up with a charge, parent doesn't come forward to pick up the kid, they refer them to us. We also get kids that are immigration raids. So kids might be a traffic stop full of undocumented persons. ICE gets called. We get a referral that way. Kid or a victim of trafficking. We get kids also. We work with HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, who investigate trafficking and smuggling and fraud and that sort of thing. We might get a kid who's been found in a brothel, or we might have a kid who's being in a forced labor situation. HSI does an investigation, finds that kid, refers them to us. So when they refer them to us, they call our intakes hotline. We have a 24-hour day, 7-day a week intake hotline. And then we designate placement based on the UAC's needs and capacity. Like Ashley said, we go with the least restrictive placement. And really, honestly, most of the time we have very little information on these kids. They might have a birth certificate and a phone number to whoever they're going to, and that's it. The referring federal agency will transport the child to the OR funded placement, and then OR will then assume custody of the UAC once they arrive to the program. I'm running out of time, but I want to go over the network of care. We have approximately 80 care providers in 14 states, so we're a pretty big system. That primary care is always the least restrictive environment, so the majority of our programs are shelter programs. They're the least restrictive settings that we have. They're all licensed in their respective states, so these programs are licensed in Texas, licensed in wherever they're located. And as you can see from the map, we've expanded capacity a little bit, but most of our beds, surprise, surprise, are in Texas. And then followed by Arizona, and then we have a lot of beds in Chicago, Florida, New York, California. And we have a lot of beds in those areas because we find we release a lot of kids to those areas. Because we actually have a lot of families that are kids getting reunified in the Northeast. So again, we try place in least restrictive settings. So again, we primarily shelter care. It's where a majority of our kids go. We have also a staff secure placement, and those are kids that have some behavioral issues or criminal charges that go and they need more structure that a shelter can provide. And then we have secure, and Ashley works with 2 of the 5 secure programs. So Ashley's got a lot of experience in working with this population. It's a very specialized population and probably the most complex cases as far as I'm sure immigration cases, and also family reunification, because we do reunify those children if we can. But those beds are reserved for kids under the law. They have to be considered a danger to self or danger to others. So these kids are only placed there if they have serious violent criminal charges or violent history. So the kids that we put there committed some serious crimes. We also have therapeutic staff secure, so kids with some mental health issues and their needs can't be met in like a shelter facility, they would go to there for some treatment while they're waiting for reunification. We also have a 6-bed sex offender treatment facility, so if we have any kids that have been charged with any sex crimes that are in need of treatment, and they're recommended to go to such a placement, we will refer them to that facility. It's in Seattle. We have transitional foster care, and that's for our younger kids and sibling groups. So when we have kids that come in that are 12 years or under, or that are sibling groups or have special needs, we will try to place them in transitional foster care. Long-term foster care, Ashley talked about that, and those are placements. Those are licensed foster families, the kids who go to school in the community, and those are kids that have absolutely no family reunification at all, but have been identified as potentially having a form of legal relief. And then we have a residential treatment center, and those are kids with serious mental health issues, and it's been recommended they go there by a psychologist or a psychiatrist. The services that we provide across the board is room and board and case management, counseling. They get counseling every week. They also all kids are screened for human trafficking as well. They get group counseling twice a week, medical services, educational, rec, acculturation services, vocational programs if they're still here, access to religious services, legal service orientation. So when Ashley and her group comes in, they do a Know Your Rights presentation explaining why they're in federal custody and their rights, and what their rights are while they're in federal custody. And then if they're still here, they will do an intake to determine whether or not the child has legal relief or not. And then when they're released, if they can, they will try to link them to pro bono services wherever they're reunited. And then transportation, so we transport them to all appointments. And then if family reunification is approved and that family cannot afford the cost to return that child back to reunify, we will pay for that. That's where I work. That's my phone number where you can contact me and bother me. And this is a website. It gives you actually more information about our program and what we do, and actually the TVPRA and Homeland Security Act and Flores is on there as well, and any information on SIJ. It's very helpful as well. So that's it for me, and I will sit down.
So I'd like to thank all of our speakers, and maybe in my prerogative as moderator, set up the possibility to maybe take a couple of questions for everyone to consider, and then give everyone a little time to respond as opposed to going question by question. And maybe I'll just sort of throw a question out there first for all of the panelists to consider. It seemed in Ashley's presentation when she talked about some of the numbers that we have this pretty substantial uptick in the numbers of of unaccompanied immigrant children coming into the United States, and we have sort of a system of facilities to accommodate them, but it seems like from what Ashley's saying that it's growing pretty fast. And on the other side, Professor Zug was talking about, while not in exactly the same context, the tendency of our system to not completely appreciate parental rights. And so it just strikes me where you have sort of this uptick of lots of kids coming in, unaccompanied as they may be, and a system that maybe doesn't adequately appreciate parental rights. There's the potential for some problems to arise. And so maybe just one thing that I'd throw out there in anticipation of other questions is comments from panelists on some of the problems that they foresee moving forward with these sort of two concepts of a rapidly growing population and the possibility to overlook the parental rights of the parents in the picture. Just a very broad question. So what are some other questions that people have that we can throw in the mix for our panelists to respond to? Yeah, Kyle.
None of you mentioned deferred action for child arrival, DACA. Is that insignificant for the purposes of this discussion, or is it an insignificant program?
Okay, so we have on the table the potential insignificance or significance of deferred action for childhood arrival, a form of prosecutorial discretion for children. Are there other questions? Yeah, Sean.
In situations where parents are in detention or deported, do the children come into your program, David, or is that different?
Okay, great. Yes.
One of my students is doing a paper on rape trees. It was something that I was not familiar with regard to adults and children coming over and I guess being sexually assaulted on the way over by their handler, and sort of the lack, and some of this is happening on U.S. land. And so to the extent that you don't know anything about that, just interested to know whether there's any, I guess, anything legal like that the United States is doing with regard to these types of assaults and the services that are provided for the children or women that are being assaulted.
Great, thank you. Anything else? Yeah.
Suppose I'm an undocumented person in the U.S. with my children, and I'm seized while my children are in my company, so I'm not seized at work. What, if anything, can I do to maintain access to the children?
Okay. Great. And so maybe we will let our panelists chew on these questions, maybe in the order in which they presented, taking a couple of minutes, and we'll see if there's some more questions after that, if we have time.
Go through each one?
Whichever ones you choose to answer.
Okay. Well, those are all wonderful questions. Some are more me, some are less me. Your question about the intersection, I guess. So we've growing population and maybe less respect for parents' rights. Well, I think one of the things I could do, both of you were talking about reunification services, and if we have a growing lack of respect for parents' rights, then it would be perhaps less likely to look to parents as a placement for these kids. Right? One of the things that I've seen in some of the court cases is undocumented families who want to take children, and the courts being like, no, and Child Protective Services and various agencies saying, no, we won't place a child with an undocumented relative. So the more there's that feeling, the less likely these kids to have reunification, and they're older, a lot of them, and then they're not probably going anywhere. So I see that as increasingly bad all around. In terms of deferred action, one of the things that I've seen with that is an argument for not sending the kids back with their parents. So even if the kid's not an American citizen, the fact that they now have a path towards it would mean that, okay, they're here, chances are they'd be able to stay here if we keep them here, and here is better than there. So that's an argument for not reunifying them with their parents. So I'm sure both of you can talk about the practical aspects of it more. Don't know anything about returns. And if you got picked up with your family and you got put in detention, the new ICE regulations should make it easier, hopefully, for you to visit them. Possibly that they'll even do discretionary release. That's part of the guidelines where they say that, you know, you're not a risk or you're the primary caretaker, perhaps we'll release you.
But there's no family.
Well, oh, so your kids are, well, are your kids portable or are they?
Yes.
There are very little family detention facilities. That's one of the big problems. So usually your kids are going to go into foster care facilities. And yeah, it's, once you're separated from your children, it is exponentially harder to ever get back to them. So it's a big problem. And there are some family detention facilities. There's a big issue with a lot of raids on factories with nursing mothers, and you know, eventually they were released to nurse their children. But part of the problem was that the kids couldn't go with them. It's a disastrous mess. No good news there.
Thank you. Ashley?
And let me address first the question about the influx and all the kids coming up, because I touched on it a little bit. But as I said, a lot of the children are coming to the United States because of these push factors in their home country. There are some pull factors in that maybe they have a mother, father, aunt, or uncle who's here, and so they're driven to come up. But predominantly there are these push factors. And so about 50% of the kids that I would screen are probably victims of domestic violence, abuse, and neglect. And so they might be eligible for this special immigrant juvenile status. Now, in terms of parental rights and what that means, sometimes our kids have no knowledge of who their parents were. They might have grown up street children. David and I have seen kids that don't have a birth certificate. They don't know their formal name. They don't really know their birthday. And so in order to approximate that, the government will do bone density tests, dental record tests. And so in cases like that, when family courts are reviewing these cases, they may not need to give notice to a parent who is not ascertainable. And so in granting this special immigrant juvenile status, maybe the parental rights are terminated, but maybe not. It's not necessarily a requirement for special immigrant juvenile status. In other cases where you are alleging that a child has been abused or neglected and the parent is somewhat connected, you can obtain consent, written consent from the parents for them to give up their parental rights or consent to any sort of custody proceedings. And sometimes we are able to do that, but other times the courts might just provide constructive notice on the parents through publication and whatnot. Now, for DACA, for deferred action, the problem with DACA and with the population that we work with, if you remember, people who are eligible for DACA have to have these positive factors of education, like a GED or high school, but they also have to have this time requirement. They have to have arrived in the United States before they were 16 and be in the United States for 5 years before June 15, 2012, when DACA was announced by President Obama. And in addition, they have to have not no criminal history, but they can't have a serious criminal history. So for the children who are recent arrivals, they don't qualify for DACA because they don't meet those time requirements. And then for the children who have been here for a while, they've grown up here, they might never have known they were undocumented until ICE caught them and they ran a check. They might qualify for DACA, but because I work in staff secured and high security facilities as well, usually the shelter kids are for the recent arrivals, those kids might have a criminal history that make it a little bit more challenging for DACA. So in my experience, the people who are eligible for DACA are probably the people who may not have had any brush with immigration, or if they did, it wasn't for a very serious criminal history. And then in terms of people who have been victimized and coming into the U.S. or once in the U.S., that's where people can apply for UNT visas. And ICE has, and David mentioned this already, HSI, so they have special agents who are trained in trafficking and to interview people and to certify them, say, as victims, and so that they can ultimately obtain relief. I'm not entirely familiar on the kinds of trainings that they would do, but I do know that these agents they do undergo special training to work with the kind of victim population that they have. So they might have experience in children or adult trafficking as well. So they do receive specialized training for that. In terms of creating a plan for people who might be undocumented, there are nonprofit organizations that create plans for families and encourage everybody to get their documents together, like passports, emergency contacts if there's ever a raid or an immigration apprehension. I know locally here, legal aid. Is it Just Children with legal aid in Charlottesville? They will do that, and other organizations as well. So it's very helpful for non-citizen families to have these safety plans in place if somebody is apprehended.
I'll take the separation one. So in order to come into our program, the child has to be without a parent. So if they're with a parent and they refer us, we will not take that child. They cannot come into our program because they are not accompanied. We see that sometimes with the marshal's office. Sometimes they'll want to refer them because they're a material witness, and we decline because they are not. They do not meet the legal definition of an unaccompanied alien child. I can't really speak about DHS and separation policies. I know that we have gotten cases where I can give just anecdotally. I can give you where we've gotten cases where an uncle comes in with a child and they have no proof of relationship. So because DHS will check that, they'll say, do you have like birth certificates and everything, and they'll check them and everything. If they don't, they will declare them unaccompanied and they'll refer them to us. And we have seen where DHS will release that adult and TA serve a notice to appear, just like they serve our kids, and they actually will look at exploring reunification options with that person if we can. If there's no safety concerns noted by DHS. And then you said could you explain that a little bit?
So rape trees, it wasn't trained, just so you
No.
know. So rape trees, the student is from a border town in Texas, and he said that they're trees where after the rape occurs, they put the undergarments of the person on the tree to mark the place where the rape occurred.
Okay.
And so they find these, periodically as I guess they're doing sweeps on the land, because most of the time it's in the U.S. that it's happening.
Right.
And so there seems to be hasn't been a lot of media or any kind of coverage of this happening, but the concern is about whether the people will even say who those persons are, because they're usually the handlers or the people who are guiding them across. And so they either know about it and take the risk of getting raped, or they don't know that it's going to happen, and it happens. But there are obviously mental health issues that may be present once they get over to the United States.
Yeah, and HSI, like Ashley said, HSI is very involved in those cases, not just with trafficking, but like assaults, and also the marshal's office gets involved in those things as well. And we'll collect, and we'll investigate, do like joint investigations with HSI to address those crimes.
Yeah, the agents will come to the detention facilities and interview the kids. Sometimes I'm able to sit in and listen. And so in those cases, a lot of the times the children may be forthcoming with information, certainly with drug trafficking and with the cartels. The children are able to identify their traffickers, give specific addresses. Sometimes before they even get to Virginia, they have been around the border, and they can take the agents to cartel houses and say exactly what their routes are and their plans. And ultimately, we have seen that has resulted in some pretty high-profile arrests, or some decent numbers of arrests. Same thing for children who have been victims of sex trafficking or sex assault. It's just they might be a little bit less likely to come forward, but ultimately that information is really helpful for law enforcement. And so It is in law enforcement's best interest to have this specialized training and to treat the children appropriately to gain that information, because ultimately that child might be the main witness in a case.
Are there any other questions? Then I will thank our panelists very much for their time.
Okay, everybody. We're going to get ready to close up now. Just going to ask for your attention for a couple moments. So I'd just like to thank everybody for coming out. I'm Dominique Taylor, the Symposium editor for JCRSJ. I've been working with Professors Shaughnessy, Elwig, and Massey pretty much since July, so it's been a long time coming, but I'm glad to see that this event really worked out. It's been a lovely day. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, all of the moderators. I'd also like to thank the Shepherd Program, the Francis Lewis Law Center, and Themis Bar for co-sponsoring this event. And of course, I'd like to thank my fellow JCRSJ board members and all of our staff writers who helped me. And lastly, Lee Kirchner and Bree Kleiner, 2 administrative assistants here at school, who really helped keep my head on straight over the last few days. So with that being said, like I said, I won't take up too much of your time. I'm just going to read you 2 quick quotes, give you my take on them, and then get you on out of here so you can get back to your families and loved ones. The first one's just a simple African proverb that we've all have heard before. It takes a village to raise a child. We've heard a lot of it today about what children need. We've heard a little bit about abuse and neglect, the plight of LGBT children, and the plight of immigrant children, especially those coming into our country undocumented. Now, I ask that each of you remember what you heard today. I ask that you spread the word. If you are troubled by the trouble of Dasani and her family in New York, or of Catherine in the Midwest, please talk about this. Talk to your loved ones. Talk to your family. Because it's only through talking and facilitating discussion about these difficult issues that we can really spark change in our society. So please just talk, watch YouTube videos, repost things on Twitter or Facebook. Do whatever, take a stand. Law students, you have an opportunity to sign up to work with CASA. I urge you to do that. Any 2Ls or 1Ls in the building, I urge you to consider Professor Baluarte's immigration clinic, where we work with the CARE Coalition, and we do some pretty remarkable work. It's pretty amazing. So I urge you to do all those things. And just lastly, I'll leave you with a quote from Nelson Mandela. Safety and security just don't happen. They are the result of collective consensus and public investment. We owe our children, the most vulnerable citizens in our society, a choice to live a life free from violence and free from fear. Now, we talked a lot about the plight faced by undocumented children and about LGBT children. Now, I ask you that to just do something simple that we all can probably do, is just listen, pay attention to these stories, and try not to judge. We see there's a lot of miscommunication that goes on in our society. Just recently, we had the trial of Michael Dunn for the shooting of Jordan Davis. Basically started over rap music. But if we better understand our children, understand the way that they live their lives, understand that they don't choose to be gay or bisexual, that these are things that make up who they are, but we don't choose who we are, we don't choose our parents, we don't choose our life circumstances. If we can better understand children and just talk to them, facilitate these discussions, I think that we'll already be making strides towards becoming a better society. And hey, after all, these are the people who will be leading us into the future. So if we want to make our children into productive members of society, we have to do all that we can to raise them up as a society, as a village, to ensure that they're in a position to succeed as adults. So I'll leave you with that. Thanks for coming out, and safe travels to all of you.